The global discourse on humanitarian aid and migration has long grappled with the inefficiencies inherent in relocating populations from economically disadvantaged regions to wealthier nations. Traditional approaches emphasize resettlement in host countries like the United States, where support systems are established but often come at exorbitant costs. This model not only strains public resources but also overlooks the potential for more effective interventions that address root causes in origin countries. By redirecting funds through existing international networks, assistance could foster local development, reducing the impetus for migration while maximizing the value of each dollar spent. Such a shift challenges the prevailing paradigm, which prioritizes physical relocation over sustainable, localized solutions, and invites a critical examination of whether current practices truly serve the intended beneficiaries or perpetuate dependency cycles. Economic analyses reveal stark disparities in the cost-effectiveness of aid delivery. In high-cost environments like the United States, supporting individuals through welfare, education, and healthcare can exceed tens of thousands of dollars annually per person, whereas equivalent support in lower-cost origin countries might require only a fraction of that amount. This discrepancy arises from differences in living expenses, where basic necessities such as food and shelter are significantly cheaper abroad. Proponents of in-country aid argue that this approach avoids the additional burdens of transportation, legal processing, and integration, which inflate overall expenditures. Moreover, it aligns with principles of fiscal responsibility, suggesting that reallocating budgets from enforcement-heavy immigration systems to direct foreign assistance could yield substantial savings without compromising humanitarian goals. Critically, this reorientation demands a nuanced understanding of migration drivers, including poverty, instability, and lack of opportunities, which are better mitigated at the source. Historical evidence indicates that targeted investments in livelihoods and infrastructure can temporarily deter emigration, though long-term effects vary. The migration hump phenomenon, where initial aid boosts mobility before higher development levels stabilize populations, underscores the need for strategic implementation. Ultimately, an introduction to this framework sets the stage for exploring how in-country aid could transform global charity networks, emphasizing efficiency, cultural preservation, and reduced domestic disruptions in host nations. Economic efficiency of direct aid versus resettlement. The principle of purchasing power parity, PPP, fundamentally demonstrates why delivering humanitarian aid directly in migrants' countries of origin offers far greater economic efficiency than resettling individuals in high-cost nations like the United States. In lower-income regions across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, everyday essentials, food, basic healthcare, housing, and utilities, carry substantially lower price tags due to differences in wage levels, local production costs, and market structures. A concrete illustration is that providing ongoing support for nutrition, medical access, and modest shelter in a country like Honduras can require only 1/5 to 1/10 of the financial outlay needed for comparable assistance in the United States, where labor-intensive services, regulatory compliance, and urban living expenses drive costs upward dramatically. This amplified purchasing power means that the same budget allocation can sustain a much larger number of people at a basic level of dignity and security, directly addressing immediate survival needs without the necessity of international travel or legal resettlement processes. Furthermore, when aid is channeled into local economies through targeted investments, such as seed funding for farming cooperatives, microloans for small enterprises, or infrastructure improvements, it generates positive ripple effects that include job creation, skill development, and strengthened community resilience. These localized multipliers help weaken the very structural drivers of migration, such as persistent poverty, food insecurity, and lack of opportunity, offering a proactive rather than reactive form of humanitarian intervention. In contrast, resettlement in wealthier host countries imposes heavy and multifaceted financial burdens. Beyond direct welfare payments, host societies face indirect but significant costs related to public school overcrowding, healthcare system strain, housing shortages, and administrative overhead for processing, monitoring, and integration services. These cumulative expenses make the conventional model increasingly difficult to justify on purely economic grounds, especially when domestic priorities compete for the same limited fiscal resources. Remittances from migrants already function as a powerful, real-world demonstration of the advantages of direct financial support delivered to origin countries, serving as a private sector counterpart to what could become formalized government aid programs. Year after year, these household-to-household transfers dwarf official development assistance in total volume, frequently reaching 3 times, or in some cases even more, the amount of governmental humanitarian and development aid combined. In recipient economies where remittances account for a meaningful share of gross domestic product, sometimes 5%, 10%, or higher in smaller nations, they provide families with reliable funds that are spent primarily on consumption needs, food, clothing, utilities, human capital investments, school fees, medical treatment, and productive activities, starting or expanding small businesses, purchasing agricultural inputs, or home improvements. This pattern illustrates vividly how foreign currency gains extraordinary leverage in low-cost environments, transforming relatively modest sums into life-changing improvements that would demand vastly greater expenditure if the same level of support were provided through domestic welfare systems in high-income countries. Recent policy interventions, however, introduced new frictions. The imposition of taxes on certain outbound remittance transfers in the United States, for instance, reduces the net amount reaching families and may push more transactions into informal, less trackable channels. Such developments strengthen the case for official programs that deliberately imitate the targeted, family-level efficiency of remittances while incorporating modern safeguards, such as blockchain-based tracking or mobile money platforms, that minimize leakage and fraud risks. When viewed side by side, the comparison exposes the stark fiscal inefficiency of resettlement, particularly for low-skilled or economically vulnerable migrants, whose lifetime tax contributions in the host country typically fall well short of the public benefits and services they receive, creating sustained net fiscal burdens that weigh heavily on taxpayers and public budgets. Any serious economic evaluation of shifting toward in-country aid must candidly confront the potential limitations and unintended consequences that could arise from such a reorientation. One well-documented concern is the so-called migration hump dynamic. In the early stages of economic improvement, additional household income from aid can temporarily increase the financial capacity of families to finance migration journeys, potentially leading to short-term rises in emigration rather than the desired reduction. This nonlinear relationship between rising prosperity and migration pressure has been observed across multiple developing regions and underscores the importance of careful program design. That said, evidence from carefully implemented initiatives in places like Guatemala, focused on rural agricultural support and market access, and various West African countries, emphasizing vocational training and youth employment schemes, shows that when aid is deliberately oriented toward building sustainable local livelihoods, it can progressively lower the desire and perceived necessity to migrate over the medium to longer term. By routing assistance through well-established international organizations such as the World Food Programme and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, direct aid programs can sidestep the enormous logistical, legal, administrative, and social complexities that accompany large-scale resettlement efforts, ranging from border security and transportation logistics to asylum adjudication, language training, and cultural integration support. At the same time, keeping recipients in their home communities preserves social bonds, linguistic continuity, familial networks, and cultural identity, all of which are frequently disrupted or lost during transnational moves. Taken together, this economic analysis strongly advocates for a decisive paradigm shift in humanitarian strategy, one that redefines success not by the number of people physically relocated and resettled, but by the tangible, measurable improvement in well-being achieved per dollar spent. Such a reorientation would inevitably call into question the long-term viability and moral defensibility of charity models that remain centered on immigration and resettlement in an age of fiscal constraint, competing domestic needs, and mounting evidence that localized interventions can deliver superior humanitarian returns with significantly fewer collateral disruptions. Challenges of fraud and corruption in aid systems. Fraudulent and corrupt practices constitute one of the most persistent and damaging obstacles to the effective delivery of humanitarian and development assistance through global charity networks. High-profile cases, such as the deliberate inflation of refugee headcounts in Uganda to inflate funding requests, or the documented misuse and diversion of relief supplies and cash in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake, vividly illustrate how weak governance, limited transparency, and high-stakes emergency environments create fertile ground for embezzlement, kickback schemes, fictitious vendors, and sham intermediary organizations. Independent audits of large-scale donors, including programs run by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, regularly identify instances of disallowed or questioned costs, although these disallowed amounts often represent only a small fraction of total disbursements, typically well under 1%. The repeated discovery of irregularities nonetheless feeds widespread public skepticism and the perception that systemic fraud is far more pervasive than official figures. Acknowledge. These problems are intensified by structural moral hazards unique to humanitarian crises. The urgency of response, the difficulty of real-time monitoring in chaotic or insecure settings, and the sheer volume of funds flowing rapidly through multiple layers of local and international partners all combine to create opportunities for personal enrichment at the expense of intended beneficiaries. From a critical vantage point, it is important to acknowledge that not every organization or project is tainted by corruption. Many dedicated staff and partners operate with integrity under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Nevertheless, the frequency and visibility of scandals involving aid workers, local officials, and affiliated entities necessitate far stronger, independent, and proactive oversight mechanisms if the sector is to maintain credibility and ensure that the overwhelming majority of resources actually reach those in genuine need. When governments become major funders of these networks, the scale and structure of the allocations often amplify vulnerabilities rather than reduce them. Large, multi-year grants and contracts invite opportunities for opaque backroom arrangements, inflated procurement bids, and project designs that prioritize the administrative or political interests of donors and implementing partners over the long-term outcomes desired by recipient communities. Historical examples, most notably the substantial leakage and diversion of Western aid flows into black market channels in post-communist Romania and Russia during the 1990s, demonstrate how external resources can inadvertently distort local economies, enrich elites, and undermine genuine reconstruction when accountability mechanisms are weak or politically compromised. Contemporary patterns reveal significant variation. Rigorous spot checks in relatively stable environments, such as certain aid operations in Ukraine, have shown comparatively low levels of diversion, while conflict zones and highly fragile states continue to exhibit markedly higher rates of leakage and misappropriation, indicating that the incidence of fraud is heavily context-dependent and tied to the strength of local institutions, the rigor of donor-imposed transparency requirements, and the effectiveness of on-the-ground enforcement. Skeptical observers go further, arguing that certain international bodies, including elements of the United Nations system, through opaque partnerships and poorly monitored cooperative frameworks, effectively facilitate migration management schemes that channel resources toward relocation and resettlement pathways rather than genuine in-country stabilization and self-sufficiency. This line of critique frequently invokes the concept of manufactured or artificially prolonged crises, suggesting that ongoing aid dependency serves the institutional self-interest of humanitarian bureaucracies and their intermediaries more than it resolves the underlying drivers of poverty, displacement, and vulnerability for affected populations. Meaningful progress in addressing these entrenched challenges requires deliberate movement toward mechanisms that maximize transparency, minimize bureaucratic intermediaries, and place resources as directly as possible into the hands of intended recipients. Direct cash transfers, delivered through mobile money platforms, biometric verification, or other traceable digital systems, have gained prominence precisely because they reduce the number of hands through which funds pass, thereby shrinking opportunities for diversion and enabling real-time auditing and beneficiary feedback. Despite the promise of such innovations, however, fraud and mismanagement continue to persist across both domestic and international aid landscapes, underscoring the urgent need for deeper, more radical structural reforms, including the willingness to defund, restructure, or entirely replace chronically underperforming organizations and programs that fail to demonstrate verifiable impact. Redirecting resources toward more accountable, community-verified local networks and grassroots systems has the potential to dramatically improve the integrity and perceived legitimacy of aid delivery, thereby rebuilding donor and public confidence in its humanitarian mission. Yet entrenched political interests, institutional inertia, and the entrenched preference for enforcement-oriented domestic spending over experimental or reform-oriented foreign aid initiatives frequently obstruct such transformations. Ultimately, this critical examination positions fraud and corruption not merely as isolated operational failures but as a core, systemic impediment to achieving equitable, effective, and dignified humanitarian outcomes. Any credible proposal to pivot toward greater reliance on in-country support must therefore incorporate robust, multilayered safeguards, ranging from independent third-party audits and real-time digital tracking to performance-based funding and swift defunding triggers, that actively deter exploitation, prioritize demonstrable results, and ensure that every dollar expended genuinely alleviates suffering, rather than enriching corrupt actors or perpetuating cycles of dependency and institutional self-interest. Cultural and social implications of immigration. Immigration inherently generates profound cultural disruptions that affect both the migrants themselves and the societies that receive them, often resulting in the severance of deep-rooted ties to familiar social, linguistic, and familial environments. When individuals relocate to a host nation such as the United States, they frequently encounter significant barriers to assimilation, including language difficulties, differing social norms, and experiences of perceived or actual discrimination that can breed resentment and unmet expectations. These challenges commonly manifest in public expressions of grievance directed toward the receiving country, where newcomers may voice dissatisfaction with systemic inequalities or cultural mismatches, thereby contributing to heightened social tensions within communities. In some cases, this discontent extends to active advocacy for additional migration from their countries of origin, creating self-reinforcing cycles of influx that further strain integration processes and amplify feelings of alienation on both sides. A critical alternative lies in preserving cultural integrity through in-country aid strategies, which enable people to remain embedded in their native communities, sustaining essential elements such as language continuity, traditional practices, extended family structures, and local social networks that displacement inevitably erodes. By keeping assistance localized, this model substantially reduces the likelihood of cultural clashes that arise when divergent value systems compete for dominance in shared public spaces, thereby alleviating pressures on community cohesion, public institutions, and social harmony in host societies. Social problems linked to immigration, particularly those involving crime rates and welfare dependency, are often highlighted as preventable burdens that a direct in-country aid framework could effectively circumvent. Although comprehensive data indicate that immigrant populations as a whole tend to exhibit lower incarceration rates compared to native-born citizens across various demographic categories, short-term strains on law enforcement, judicial systems, and social service infrastructures remain significant, contributing to substantial net fiscal costs running into the tens of billions of dollars annually at national and local levels. Low-skilled entrants, in particular, frequently depend heavily on public assistance programs during initial settlement periods, reinforcing public perceptions of immigration as a form of invasion or exploitation that disproportionately burdens taxpayers and diverts resources from domestic priorities. In contrast, channeling aid directly to individuals and communities in their home countries empowers them to contribute productively to local economies, fostering self-sufficiency and economic participation without transferring dependency obligations to foreign welfare systems. This perspective sharply critiques the apparent hypocrisy embedded in many domestic charity initiatives, which, while providing symbolic or limited relief within host nations, ultimately impose far-reaching societal costs, including heightened security concerns, resource competition, and social fragmentation, while failing to deliver comprehensive or sustainable solutions to the underlying humanitarian needs. A more thorough examination of generational dynamics reveals both promising trajectories and persistent obstacles in the immigration experience, underscoring the advantages of localized aid alternatives. Over time, the children of immigrants frequently attain levels of economic achievement and educational attainment comparable to or exceeding those of native populations, demonstrating significant upward mobility and integration success across multiple generations. However, initial hurdles, ranging from linguistic barriers and educational disparities to social exclusion and identity conflicts, often endure for the first generation, complicating optimistic narratives of seamless assimilation. Attitudes toward the host society tend to become more positive with prolonged exposure and generational progression, yet these shifts are frequently complicated by deep political polarization that frames immigration debates in highly divisive terms, hindering consensus on effective policy responses. Redirecting humanitarian focus toward origin countries enables more direct and culturally sensitive addressing of immediate necessities such as hunger, disease, shelter, and basic security, while simultaneously minimizing disruptive effects on host societies, including strained public services, community divisions, and fiscal pressures. This cultural and social framework therefore strongly advocates for localized humanitarian solutions, positing that genuine compassion and effective assistance should prioritize the minimization of large-scale global population movements, the preservation of cultural continuity, and the cultivation of self-reliance in place, rather than perpetuating the frictions and dislocations that inevitably accompany mass migration. Alternatives: exporting volunteers and leveraging existing networks. Exporting volunteers from wealthier nations to provide direct assistance in migrants' countries of origin offers a viable and proactive alternative to conventional immigration-based humanitarian models, effectively redirecting charitable enthusiasm toward on-the-ground engagement in regions experiencing acute needs. Established programs such as the Peace Corps exemplify this approach by deploying thousands of volunteers each year to diverse global settings, where they undertake extended commitments focused on critical areas including education, public health, agricultural development, and community empowerment. These initiatives operate on relatively modest budgets when compared to the enormous expenditures associated with immigration enforcement and resettlement systems, yet they generate substantial long-term value by building local institutional capacity, transferring practical skills, and directly confronting root causes of migration such as entrenched poverty, limited economic opportunities, and environmental instability. Volunteers typically immerse themselves fully in host communities, receiving basic living stipends rather than competitive salaries, which preserves the cost-effectiveness of the model while ensuring authentic grassroots impact through sustained personal relationships and culturally attuned interventions. Critically, this export-oriented strategy shifts the primary burden of humanitarian action away from host nations' domestic infrastructure and social fabric, instead channeling proactive goodwill abroad and thereby fulfilling genuine charitable motivations without incurring the integration costs, social tensions, or fiscal strains that accompany large-scale immigration inflows. A variety of additional organizations and programs complement the Peace Corps model by providing flexible opportunities for individuals to support displaced or vulnerable populations directly in their regions of origin or transit. Entities such as the Red Cross and the International Rescue Committee maintain international volunteer rosters that enable participants to engage in essential activities including emergency response training, psychosocial support services, livelihood development workshops, and educational initiatives tailored to local contexts. Private and non-profit platforms further facilitate short-term volunteer placements in high-migration source areas, concentrating efforts on skill-building programs in job creation, vocational training, entrepreneurship, and community health that address structural drivers of displacement. By reallocating portions of existing humanitarian budgets, currently dominated by enforcement and domestic resettlement, wealthier countries could significantly scale these volunteer export mechanisms, transforming superficial or performative domestic gestures into meaningful, high-impact contributions abroad. This shift directly challenges widespread critiques of virtue-signaling behavior, in which limited financial donations, occasional church-based volunteering, or symbolic advocacy often substitute for substantive personal sacrifice while still endorsing policies that impose broader societal burdens. Encouraging individuals to invest their time, skills, and resources directly in foreign communities promotes authentic engagement, accountability, and measurable outcomes that domestic symbolic efforts rarely achieve. Leveraging established global networks for the efficient distribution of direct aid serves as a natural complement to volunteer exports, creating a comprehensive framework that maximizes humanitarian impact while minimizing migration pressures and domestic disruptions. Organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, already maintain extensive operational presence in origin and transit countries, positioning them to channel funds toward targeted interventions with relative efficiency and scale. Private remittances continue to serve as a powerful real-world demonstration of this principle, with billions of dollars flowing annually from diaspora communities to support origin economies, fund household needs, and stimulate local development without requiring physical relocation of beneficiaries. Hypothetically, governmental programs could replicate and expand upon this private model by adopting similar direct transfer mechanisms, provided that appropriate safeguards are implemented to address long-standing concerns about fraud, mismanagement, and diversion. When combined, volunteer exports and networked direct aid establish a coherent alternative paradigm in which humanitarian assistance remains firmly localized, thereby reducing incentives for risky migration journeys, alleviating fiscal and social strains on host societies, and ensuring that charitable resources deliver maximum benefit through cultural preservation, economic empowerment, and community-led resilience. This integrated approach ultimately redefines effective humanitarianism as one that respects geographic and cultural boundaries, prioritizes sustainable self-sufficiency, and channels goodwill in ways that genuinely alleviate suffering at its source rather than merely relocating it. Conclusion: embracing in-country solutions. Reflecting on the profound inefficiencies embedded in prevailing humanitarian models, a deliberate pivot toward in-country aid stands out as a strategically compelling and pragmatically superior alternative for confronting global disparities without resorting to the disruptive mechanics of mass population relocation. Current systems, heavily oriented toward resettlement in high-cost host nations, routinely generate exorbitant fiscal burdens through combined expenditures on enforcement, processing, welfare provision, education, and healthcare, costs that accumulate rapidly and often exceed the lifetime contributions of low-skilled entrants. In stark contrast, in-country interventions capitalize on fundamental economic realities such as purchasing power parity, enabling each dollar of assistance to deliver substantially greater tangible benefits in lower-cost origin environments. By channeling resources through established local networks and implementing transparent, fraud-resistant distribution methods, such as direct cash transfers or blockchain-verified disbursements, this approach not only maximizes resource utility but also actively mitigates long-standing vulnerabilities to corruption and mismanagement that have repeatedly undermined public confidence in global charity ecosystems. Prioritizing volunteer exports alongside localized funding further amplifies impact by fostering genuine capacity building, skill transfer, and community-led development initiatives that address root causes like poverty, limited opportunity, and instability at their source. Critically, this reorientation directly challenges the entrenched status quo, in which resettlement frequently exacerbates domestic social strains, fiscal pressures, and cultural frictions without meaningfully resolving the structural drivers of migration, thereby advocating for a more rational, evidence-informed strategy that empowers origin communities to achieve sustainable self-sufficiency rather than perpetual external dependence. The social and cultural dimensions of this proposed shift provide additional compelling justification, as localized aid inherently avoids the multifaceted integration challenges, grievances, and identity conflicts that frequently accompany large-scale immigration. By enabling individuals to remain within their familiar linguistic, familial, and communal contexts, in-country support preserves essential elements of cultural continuity and social cohesion that displacement invariably disrupts, thereby reducing the risk of alienation, resentment, or perceived exploitation in host societies. Remittances already offer robust empirical evidence of the efficacy of direct financial support in origin settings, consistently demonstrating that targeted private transfers can bolster household resilience, fund education and health improvements, and stimulate local economic activity without necessitating risky migration journeys. Targeted governmental or non-profit programs modeled on these flows, particularly those emphasizing agriculture, vocational training, and livelihood diversification, have shown promising results in curbing emigration aspirations over the medium to long term, even if initial resource infusions occasionally produce short-term mobility increases consistent with migration hump dynamics. Concurrently, confronting fraud and corruption within charities, international organizations, and migration-related networks remains an indispensable precondition for any credible reform effort. Meaningful accountability mechanisms, rigorous independent audits, and selective defunding of chronically inefficient entities are essential to prevent aid from perpetuating dependency cycles or inadvertently enriching intermediaries rather than alleviating genuine hardship. This multifaceted framework ultimately advances both fiscal responsibility and authentic altruism, repositioning global humanitarian assistance as a catalyst for genuine self-reliance and community empowerment rather than an instrument of indefinite external subsidy or managed relocation. Beyond immediate economic and social advantages, embracing in-country solutions promises to foster a more equitable and balanced global humanitarian architecture by fundamentally redefining the relationship between donor and recipient societies. Redirecting resources away from immigration-centric models toward localized interventions diminishes the incentives for irregular migration, eases overburdened border and domestic welfare systems in wealthier nations, and allows host countries to redirect attention and funding toward pressing internal challenges without the added complexity of large-scale demographic shifts. Simultaneously, this approach honors the dignity and agency of recipients by enabling them to remain rooted in their cultural and familial environments, where assistance can be tailored more precisely to local needs, priorities, and governance structures. Volunteer export programs, operating at modest cost relative to enforcement budgets, exemplify how genuine charitable intent can be channeled productively abroad, transforming performative domestic gestures into substantive, on-the-ground contributions that build lasting capacity and mutual understanding. By leveraging existing global networks responsibly, while insisting on transparency and measurable outcomes, this model circumvents many of the exploitative schemes, manufactured dependencies, and opaque partnerships that have long plagued traditional aid delivery, offering instead a pathway toward interventions that are both more humane and more effective. In conclusion, the embrace of in-country solutions over immigration-centric charity constitutes a viable and urgently needed pathway toward a more equitable, efficient, and dignified form of humanitarianism in an era of constrained resources and mounting domestic pressures. This paradigm sidesteps the recurrent pitfalls of manufactured crises, systemic fraud, and exploitative intermediary structures that have eroded trust in existing systems, instead redirecting concerted efforts toward meaningful, localized, and culturally sensitive impact. Through the strategic export of volunteers, the intelligent leveraging of economic disparities via purchasing power parity, and the rigorous application of accountability safeguards, this model not only conserves scarce fiscal resources but also upholds the intrinsic dignity and autonomy of those in need by fostering self-determination at the community level. Ultimately, it paves the way for a more balanced and sustainable global order, one in which humanitarian action genuinely alleviates suffering at its source, minimizes unnecessary global dislocations, and reduces the attendant social, cultural, and economic disruptions of unchecked migration, thereby serving the interests of both origin communities and host societies with greater integrity and foresight.